My name is Naomi Price. I am 38 years old. I am the principal of Hillsborough High School in Nashville, Tennessee, where I have worked for 12 years, the last 5 as principal, before that as a dean, before that as an English teacher. I run a school of 1,800 students and a staff of 142 people. I manage conflict, budget, personnel, and the specific, daily, unglamorous work of keeping a large institution functioning. I have been doing some version of this work my entire professional life. My father, Martin Price, was a high school history teacher at Pearl-Cohn Magnet High School in Nashville for 32 years. He retired 2 years ago. He died on a Tuesday in October of a heart attack at 67 years old. He was not sick, or not that we knew of, not in any way that had been diagnosed and named. He was there on a Monday and gone on a Tuesday, and the specific, brutal efficiency of it is something I am still, a year later, learning to carry. 312 people came to his funeral. I know the number because the funeral director told me. 312 people who had known Martin Price, former students who had come back to Nashville or who still lived here, colleagues from 32 years in Nashville public schools, parents who had watched him coach their children through track seasons, neighbors from the house in Germantown where I grew up, members of the church he had attended for 40 years. 312 people who needed someone to stand at the front of the room and tell them who he was. My best friend Diane offered to give the eulogy. She said, "Naomi, you are too close to it right now. Let me do this for you. I will write something beautiful for him." I said, "Okay." I said okay because I was shattered in the specific way of a person who has lost a parent suddenly and without warning, and because Diane had known my father for 20 years, and because I believed she would do what she said she would do. She stood at my father's funeral and gave a speech about herself. I counted the minutes. 11 of 15 minutes were about Diane Fuller, her grief, her memories of my father, how much his death was affecting her, what she was going through. 4 minutes were about Martin Price. 4 minutes for a man who had spent 32 years building something in other people's children. I sat in the front pew with my hands in my lap, and I counted every minute and I did not move. Martin Price was born in Nashville in 1956. He was the second of 4 children born to Harold and Louise Price, who were both educators. His father taught mathematics at a Nashville middle school for 30 years. His mother was a librarian at a branch of the Nashville Public Library for 25. Education was not a value the Price family performed. It was simply the water they lived in. He went to Tennessee State University, where he studied history and social studies education, and where he met my mother, Gloria, who was studying nursing. They married in 1981 and moved into the house in Germantown in 1983, the house where I grew up, the house where my brother Terrence grew up, the house my mother still lives in. He started at Pearl-Cohn the same year and did not leave for 32 years. He loved teaching. This sounds simple when I say it, and it was not simple in the living of it. He loved it with the specific, sustained, unglamorous love of someone who has chosen something difficult and has kept choosing it every year because the thing they are doing matters. He taught American history and African American history. He was known for the specific quality of his classroom. Students who had left Pearl-Cohn 10 and 15 and 20 years ago came back to visit. Not to visit the school, specifically, to visit his room. He coached track for 25 of his 32 years, not because the school needed a track coach, though it did, but because he understood that some students who could not be reached in a classroom could be reached on a track. He had an eye for the student who was running from something and a way of turning the running toward something. He had sent 17 athletes to college on track scholarships over 25 years. He kept a board in his classroom with their names and their schools. He was funny. I want to give him this specifically because the story I am about to tell could make him sound only solemn and important, and he was those things. But he was also genuinely funny in the specific way of a person who has been around 17-year-olds for 32 years and has developed a very specific understanding of what makes them laugh. He had a joke for every situation. He had a quality of ease in social gatherings that meant people found themselves in conversations with him before they had decided to have one. He was also my father. In the specific, irreducible sense, he was the person who came to my school plays and my track meets and my graduation ceremonies, and who drove me to college, and who was there when I called at 11 p.m., because being a new teacher was harder than I had expected. He was the person I called first with everything for 38 years. He was the person I lost on a Tuesday in October. He deserved 15 minutes of someone standing at a podium and telling the 312 people who came to his funeral who he was. He deserved to be named, specifically, in the room that was gathered specifically for him. He deserved a eulogy. What he received, instead, was 11 minutes of Diane Fuller explaining to the room how she was feeling about his death. And the 4 minutes that remained were not enough to hold the 32 years. Diane Fuller is 39 years old. I have known her since we were both 18, sitting next to each other in an introductory English class at Vanderbilt University, and she made a comment about the assigned reading that I found both wrong and interesting, and I told her so, and we argued for 20 minutes after class and have been talking ever since. 20 years, the length of a significant portion of my life. She is warm and intelligent and funny. I want to give her these things because they are true, and because this story is not the story of a person who is entirely bad. She is not entirely bad. She is a person who has a specific and significant quality that I had noticed over 20 years, and had managed around, and had never fully named until the Tuesday in October when it was impossible to manage around, and impossible to avoid naming. The quality, Diane is, in every situation, the most important person in the room to herself. This is not narcissism in the clinical sense. She is not without empathy. She is not cruel in the way of people who cannot feel other people's experience. She is simply always slightly more focused on her own experience than on the experience of the situation. She is always slightly more interested in how she is feeling about something than in the thing itself. I have known this for 20 years. I have managed around it. In the context of a 20-year friendship, the specific ways a person centers themselves are something you negotiate. You have the conversations you need. You adjust the amount of your own life you share based on what you have learned about the quality of the listening you receive. You keep the friendship, and you carry a calibrated understanding of what it is and what it is not. I had been doing this for 20 years. What I had not understood, or had not allowed myself to fully understand, was what Diane's quality would do when given access to the most important and most public context I had ever offered it. I had managed her self-centering in private. At dinner tables, in phone calls, in the ordinary exchanges of a long friendship. I had not managed it at my father's funeral, because I had been too shattered to manage anything, and because I believed her when she said she would write something beautiful for him. She had known my father for 20 years. She had been to the house in Germantown many times. She had eaten at his table. She had watched him coach at a track meet I had dragged her to in our late 20s when we still lived in the same city. She had, genuinely, a relationship with him. The relationship was real. What she did with the eulogy was take her real relationship and place it at the center of the 15 minutes that were supposed to be about him. The specific quality of Diane's eulogy, the quality that I was counting minutes trying to track, was not that she said false things. She did not lie about my father. The specific quality was that everything she said was filtered through her. Her grief, her memories, her processing of his death. Every time my father appeared in the eulogy, he appeared as a supporting character in Diane's story of herself. He was the man whose death was affecting her. He was the person whose stories she was choosing to tell. He was the prop in the staging of Diane Fuller's grief, in a eulogy for Martin Price, at his funeral. Diane called me 2 days after my father died. She called me in the way of a best friend calling about a loss, warm, present, the specific warmth of someone who has known you for 20 years and knows what you sound like when you are broken. She said, "Naomi, I am so sorry, I cannot believe it. I am here. Tell me what you need." I said I did not know yet what I needed. She said that was okay. She said she was going to come to Nashville, she lived in Atlanta at the time, and she would be there for the service. 2 days later, she called again. She said, "I want to give the eulogy." She said it with the warmth of the offer, genuine, I believe, genuinely intended. She said, "You are too close to it. You need to be in the pew with your family, not at the podium. Let me do this for you. I know who he was. I knew him for 20 years. I will write something that honors him." I said yes, not because I could not have written a eulogy for my own father, because I was shattered, because I believed her, because the offer seemed, in the moment of it, like exactly what a 20-year best friend was for. I should have asked to see the draft. I know this now. I should have said, "Send it to me before Saturday, let me read it, let me add the things you might not know." I did not say this because I was managing the logistics of burying a parent, the death certificate and the funeral home and the flowers and the reception and the coordination of the family who was arriving from everywhere, and because I trusted her. Trust is not naivety. I want to be clear about this because the story could be read as, "Naomi should have known better, she should have checked." I am not prepared to accept that framing. I was trusting a 20-year friendship in the most vulnerable moment of my adult life. The failure was not mine for trusting. The failure was Diane's for what she did with the trust. She sent me a text the Thursday before the Saturday service that said, "I have it. It is beautiful, you are going to be proud of it, trust me." I texted back, "Thank you. I have carried the weight of those 3 words for a year." I was trusting her with something that could not be given back once it was done. The eulogy for your father happens once. There is no second opportunity. She had it. It was not beautiful, and I am not proud of it. The funeral was on a Saturday. The weather was the weather of Nashville in October, the specific, almost theatrical autumn of a day that belongs in the frame of a significant moment, the kind of weather that makes you aware you are inside something important. Pearlcone sent a delegation, his department chair, 3 current teachers who had been his colleagues for years, and 12 students, current and former, who had organized themselves to attend in his honor. The track program sent the team. My father's church sent the choir, who sang 2 of his favorite hymns before the service began. The room was full in the specific way that a room is full for a person who has given a long time to a lot of people. My mother sat beside me in the front pew, my brother Terence on her other side. The family arrayed down the front rows in the order of people who have lost someone and are sitting in the closest proximity to the fact of it. The service ran in the order that had been planned: the opening prayer, the hymns, the scripture readings, and then the eulogy. Diane stood up from 2 rows behind me and walked to the podium with the ease of someone who had been there before in some form. She speaks for a living. She is a communications consultant. She is comfortable at the front of a room. She adjusted the microphone. She looked out at the room. She began. The first 2 minutes were about my father. She described meeting him for the first time 20 years ago when she came to Nashville and I brought her home for Thanksgiving. She described his laugh. She described something specific he had said to her that she had never forgotten. These 2 minutes were right. These 2 minutes were what a eulogy is. I was in the front pew with my hands folded and I was breathing and receiving it. Then something shifted. The shift was subtle, a transition sentence that moved from what my father had said to her to how she had felt when she heard he had died. A natural thing, in a eulogy. People describe how a death landed for them, but the transition did not come back to my father. The transition went deeper into Diane. She described calling me when she heard the news and how difficult that call was for her. She described the drive from Atlanta to Nashville and what she had thought about on the way. She described what it was like to arrive at the house in Germantown and to see my mother, and to be part of this grief as someone who had loved him too. She described a memory of a dinner at the house 2 years ago, the last time she had seen him, and what that dinner had been like for her, and what she had felt leaving the house that night, and how she had not known, driving away, that it was the last time. She described what the news of his death had done to her understanding of her own mortality. She described what it felt like to be standing at the podium. My father appeared, in these minutes, as an occasion. He was the occasion of her grief. He was the occasion of her reflection on mortality. He was the occasion of her drive from Atlanta. He was the occasion of the last dinner. He was the frame around which Diane Fuller's inner life was displayed to 312 people who had come to a church in Nashville on a Saturday in October because they had loved Martin Price. And I sat in the front pew with my hands folded, and I counted the minutes, and I did not move. I was counting because counting was the only thing I could do that would keep me in my seat. I am a principal. I know how to stay in my seat when I want to get up. I know how to maintain composure in rooms where the composure is costing me something significant. I counted because the counting gave my mind something to do while the rest of me sat with what was happening. 2 minutes and 40 seconds. The portion of the eulogy that was about my father. 11 minutes and 20 seconds. The portion that was about Diane. 14 seconds. The closing, which did return to my father, a short sentence about his legacy, the word legacy, which is the word you use when you are ending a eulogy and realize you have not said enough about the person. These numbers are approximate. I was not running a formal timer. But they are close, because I was paying attention in the specific way of a person who understands that they are witnessing something that will not be able to be addressed in the room, and that the addressing will have to happen later, and that later requires knowing exactly what happened. The most specific harm of the 11 minutes was not that Diane was self-centered. I knew she was self-centered. I had known this for 20 years. The most specific harm was what the 11 minutes communicated to the 312 people in the room about who Martin Price was. Eulogies create the public record of a person's life. Eulogies are what the people who did not know someone well enough to have their own specific memories take away. For the people in that room who had a passing acquaintance with my father, colleagues' spouses, the parents of students he had briefly taught, the distant relatives who had seen him at holidays, the eulogy was the primary text. And the primary text said, by volume, Martin Price was the man whose death is making Diane Fuller reflect on mortality. He was a supporting character in her inner life. He was someone who had mattered to her. The 32 years at Pearl Cone, the 17 athletes and their board of names and schools, the specific quality of his classroom, the humor, the history lessons, the 25 years of track, none of it was in the eulogy. After the service, people came to me with their condolences and their memories. The memories were beautiful. Former students who said, he changed how I think about history. Colleagues who said, he was the one I called when I needed to figure something out. The track team who said, he told us we could do things we did not believe we could do. All of these memories were in the room. None of them had been given a container. The eulogy had not made a container for them. It had made a container for Diane. After the service, there was the reception at the house in Germantown. The traditional food and gathering of a funeral reception, the casseroles, the sweet tea, the specific warm noise of 100 people in a house together, which is one of the forms that grief takes. I moved through it the way I move through large gatherings in a professional capacity, with the controlled warmth of someone who is present and receiving people while also managing a private interior. I thanked people for coming. I received the memories. I ate something because someone handed me a plate and said eat. Diane was at the reception. She was warm to me, in the way she had been warm throughout. She hugged me. She asked how I was holding up. She said the service had been beautiful. She said, I hope I did him justice. She said it with genuine feeling, the specific feeling of someone who had given something they believed was good and was hoping it had landed well. I said, thank you for being here. I said it because it was the thing that would allow the reception to continue without an incident that my mother would have to manage on the day of her husband's funeral. I said it, and I moved to the next person. And the counting I had been doing at the church continued in my head for the rest of the day. I did not talk to Diane about the eulogy for 3 weeks. Not because I was being strategic, because I needed the 3 weeks to understand what I was going to say and how. The principal disposition: you do not address something significant until you understand what outcome you are working toward and what approach will produce it. What I was working toward: my father deserved a speech. He deserved to have someone stand in a room and name him specifically, his work, his students, his qualities, the specific things that made him Martin Price. He had not received that speech. The speech still needed to happen. What I could give him, if not the eulogy at the funeral, was a speech at some other gathering, in some other room, that contained everything the eulogy should have held. I decided to give the speech at the gathering my mother was planning for his former students and colleagues, a separate event she had been asked to host by the track program, who wanted a chance to celebrate his legacy with the people who had known him professionally. 60 people. People who had his specific memories. People who could receive a specific speech and respond to it with their own specific truths. I was going to give my father his eulogy. 3 weeks late. But I was going to give it. Pastor Jerome Hayes had officiated my father's funeral. He had known my father for 12 years. My parents had been members of his church for that duration, and he had the specific, close knowledge of a pastor who knows a family not through crisis alone, but through the ordinary years of attendance and community. He called me 4 days after the funeral. He said, "Naomi, I want to say something to you about the service." I said, "Okay." He said, "I was watching you during the eulogy." He said it simply, without elaboration, just, "I was watching you." I said, "I noticed." He said, "I want you to know that I noticed what happened during those 15 minutes, and I am sorry it happened. Not because Diane did not love your father, I believe she did, but because those minutes were Martin's, and he did not get them." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Is there something you are planning to do about it?" He said it not as a challenge, but as an invitation, the specific, careful inquiry of someone who has watched a wrong happen and is checking whether the person who was wronged has a plan. I told him about the track program gathering. I told him what I was planning to say. He listened. When I finished, he said, "That is right." He said it the way a minister says things when they mean them fully. "That is the right thing to do." He said, "Do you want me there?" I said, "Yes." He said, "I will be there." The knowledge that Pastor Hayes had watched and understood was not a small thing. Not because I needed external validation that what had happened was wrong. I knew it was wrong, I had counted the minutes, I knew. But because there is a specific weight to being witnessed, to having someone who was in the room say, "I saw what happened. I want you to have the thing you did not get." He said one more thing before he hung up. He said, "Martin would have wanted to hear the speech. Not at the church, it was not possible at the church, but he would have wanted it somewhere. Give him somewhere." I said, "I will." And I went to work on the speech that my father should have received on the Saturday in October when 312 people filled a church in Nashville to send him off. I wrote the speech over 2 weeks. Not because it was difficult to find the content. The content was everywhere, in everything I knew about my father, in the memories that had been living in me for 38 years. It was difficult to find the form. A principal writes memos, policies, difficult letters to parents. I had not written a eulogy. I started with the thing Diane had not said, his name. I started with Martin Price, and I named him first, and I kept naming him. Every paragraph had his name in it. He was the subject of every sentence. I was not in the speech. My grief was not in the speech. My feelings about his death were not in the speech. Martin Price was in the speech. I wrote about Pearl Cone. I wrote about 32 years in the specific terms of 32 years, the number of graduating classes he had been part of, the approximate number of students who had sat in his classroom, the board with the 17 names and their schools. I wrote about the specific quality of his classroom, the way former students came back, the conversations that continued years after the class ended. I wrote about his humor. I gave specific examples, the jokes I remembered, the quality of timing he had, the way the humor was never at anyone's expense but was always at the expense of the absurd, of the gap between how things presented themselves and how they actually were. He was funny in the way of a person who paid attention. I wrote about my mother, and what 38 years of marriage to Martin Price had looked like from the inside, not the inside of the marriage, which was theirs, but the inside of a daughter's view of a marriage that was real and sustaining. I wrote about what it meant to watch your parents still hold hands at 67. I wrote about the specific memory that I had not heard in Diane's eulogy, the day he got the notification that his 17th athlete had received a full scholarship to a Division I university. He called me at work. I was in the middle of a faculty meeting. He said, Naomi. He said it the way he said my name when something significant had happened. I stepped out of the meeting. He said, 17. He said it with the specific weight of someone who has been working toward a number for 25 years and has arrived at it. I said, Dad, I said, that is everything. He said, it is, isn't it? The speech was 18 minutes. I did not time it to be 18 minutes. It was what it was when I had said what needed to be said. 18 minutes for 32 years. I read it twice out loud before the day of the track gathering, in my office with the door closed, and both times I cried not for the grief, which was always present, but for the specific release of having finally given him what the eulogy should have given him. He was in the speech. He was the whole speech. The track program gathering was held 3 weeks after the funeral, on a Saturday afternoon, at my mother's house in Germantown. My mother had prepared food. 60 people came: former athletes, current team members, coaches from competing schools who had known my father through the circuit, several of the scholarship athletes who had returned to Nashville for the occasion. Diane was not there. She had gone back to Atlanta. I had not told her about the gathering. This was a deliberate choice, not a cruel one. The gathering was for the people who had known my father in his specific professional capacity, and what I was going to say was for those people, and I did not need to manage Diane's presence while I was doing it. My mother sat in the front of the room, my brother beside her. Pastor Hayes was there in the back, as he had said he would be. I stood in my mother's living room, not at a podium, just in the open space at the front, and I said, I want to give my father the speech I should have given at the service. I said it simply without elaboration. The room understood. Several people nodded. One of the former athletes said quietly, yes, just yes. I spoke for 18 minutes. I said everything the speech contained. I said his name throughout. I described the 32 years and the board and the 17 athletes. I gave the jokes. I said the thing about my parents holding hands. I gave the memory of the phone call, 17, and his voice saying it with the weight of 25 years of work arrived at a number. The room was completely still while I spoke. Not the polite stillness of people waiting for something to end. The engaged stillness of people who are receiving something they needed and did not know they needed until it was being given. When I finished, no one spoke for a long moment. Then one of the former athletes, a man who was now in his 30s, who had run the 400 for my father in the early 2000s, said, that is who he was. He said it simply, the way you say something when language has done what language is supposed to do and produced recognition. My mother cried. She had not cried at the funeral. She had held herself together the way mothers hold themselves together at their husbands' funerals, with the specific composure of someone who understands that the gathering needs someone steady. At her own kitchen table, listening to her daughter give the speech her husband should have received, she cried. Pastor Hayes, in the back of the room, put his hands together. Diane and I have not spoken about the eulogy. This is not because the conversation has not happened, it has. 3 weeks after the funeral, when I was ready, I called her. I told her what I had experienced during the 15 minutes. I told her the count, the 11 minutes and the 4. I told her about the speech I had written and given at the gathering. I told her what had happened in that room. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, I did not realize. She said it with the specific quality of someone who genuinely had not known, not performing ignorance, not defending herself. She had given the eulogy from inside her own experience of the grief and had not tracked, in the giving of it, how much of the space she was occupying. She had not counted the minutes from the outside. She said, I am so sorry. She said, I failed you. She said, I failed him. She said it 3 times in those 3 forms, and I believe all 3 of them were genuine. I said, I know, I said, I believe you did not intend it, I said, and it still happened. The friendship is different now. Not ended, different. I carry it with a calibration that is more honest than the one I had before. What I know now, that I had managed around rather than knowing clearly before, is the full weight of what Diane's self-centering quality means in a moment when what is needed is for her to be absent from the center. I know the edges of the friendship now. In a way, I did not know them before. My father's board is on my wall now. My mother gave it to me after the gathering. 17 names and 17 schools, in his handwriting, mounted the way he had mounted it in his classroom. It is in my office at Hillsborough High School, where I am the principal, where 1,800 students are being educated, where I work. It is the first thing I see when I sit down. I am 38 years old. I am a high school principal. I run an institution that my father spent his career inside a different version of. I know what it means to show up for other people's children. I know what it costs. I know what it gives back. What I keep from this story is the speech. 18 minutes in my mother's living room, 3 weeks after the funeral, with 60 people who had known my father in his specific professional capacity. The speech that had his name in every paragraph. The speech that named the board and the 17 athletes. The speech that gave the humor and the marriage and the phone call about the number. He heard it, not in any mystical sense. I am a principal and a pragmatist, and I do not make claims I cannot support. But in the sense that matters, his people heard it. The people who had known him and loved him and come from wherever they came from to stand in my mother's kitchen with plates of food, received the speech that named who he was. That is the function of a eulogy, to tell the living what the dead were. To make the container so the memories have somewhere to go. I made the container 3 weeks late, but it held. I keep Diane in the recalibrated form that the friendship now takes. I keep Pastor Hayes saying, give him somewhere. I keep the former athlete saying, that is who he was. And I keep the board on my office wall, 17 names, 17 schools, in the handwriting of a man who spent 32 years giving other people's children a future. She stood at my father's funeral and gave a speech about herself. I counted the minutes. And then I wrote the speech he deserved. And I gave it to him. That is what I keep. If you stayed until the end, thank you. Week 5 begins here. This story is for everyone who has had a grief moment made about someone else. For everyone who has sat in a room where the space that belonged to someone they loved was taken up by a person who could not stop centering themselves, even at a funeral. For everyone who has counted the minutes. I want to say one thing directly. The speech you needed someone to give does not expire. If the eulogy was wrong, if the moment was taken, if the person was not honored in the room that was gathered for them, you can still write the speech. You can still say the thing. It will be late. That is real. It will still be received. A room of 60 people who loved my father heard his speech 3 weeks after his funeral, and it landed the way it should have landed at the service. Give them somewhere, whatever form that takes, give them somewhere. Drop your city in the comments. Tell me if you have had to write the speech someone else failed to give. Tell me what you said. I read every single one. Subscribe, hit the bell, share this. More stories coming. I'll see you next time.